Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes.
We are thrilled to announce the publication of Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers. The book, edited by the two of us, features contributions from almost 100 past guests on the podcast. It's a distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 6 years.
The book offers, we think, frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Published by Ithaca Press, Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers is available now in all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the novelist Carissa Broadbent.
We spoke to Carissa about the romantasy genre, which combines elements of romance and fantasy, how she moved from self-publishing to a deal with a major publisher, and her Crowns of Nyaxia series.
It's a great episode, and we hope you enjoy it. Carissa, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's great to have you on the show. We saw that you describe yourself as an author of books with magic and kissing, which is a nice line. And we were wondering if you could unpack that in the context of the new books, so The Serpent and the Wings of Night, and its sequel, The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King.
Yes. First of all, I've never had anyone read that back to me with like such a serious news anchor voice. So I'm glad that I now have that stored in my head. I write what is now popularly known as romantasy. I've been writing it since before it had the kind of flashy buzzword name. But I like to describe the whole subgenre as basically anything that falls under the umbrella where there's a lot of fantasy and also a lot of romance. And some of my books and some of the genre's books fall more on the romance side, where it's very much like a capital R romance set in a fantasy setting. And then others fall more on the fantasy side, where you have like these very big picture epic fantasy plots that just also happen to have a very major romance subplot. But basically, anything where like those stories can't be extracted from each other without losing the core DNA of the story.
And so tell us a little bit about these books in particular and how you came up with the ideas and kind of went about building the world that they exist in.
Sure. So these stories, specifically, The Serpent and the Wings of Night is about a young human woman who's raised in this world, high fantasy, so very much not our world of vampires. And she has to compete in a tournament to the death against all of these super badass vampire rivals. And she has to make an alliance with an inconveniently attractive competitor, as one does in these kinds of situations. And there's a lot of, battles and angry gods and wars, and the epic fantasy plot just kind of builds over the course of what will ultimately be 6 books. I came up with this story when I had just become a full-time author. So high pressure. I had just wrapped up my series that had allowed me to become a full-time author. And I was like kind of having all that existential angst of like, wow, what do I do next? And I thought, vampires sounds cool. This is very much a yes and series. So I said, I want to do vampires. What kind of vampires should I do? How about all of them? So I ended up with kind of 3 different vampire kingdoms that are kind of each different takes on vampires. I want to do gods. Like, what kind of gods should I do? How about all of them? So I wanted to create a massive world that have all of these different stories that I can play with within it.
And you touched on this in your earlier answer, but we really love unpicking some of the terminology used in particular forms of writing. So we did this a little bit with a children's author we had on a few weeks ago. But for maybe people who aren't familiar with the terminology and are kind of coming to this cold, could you just unpick really clearly the distinction between romantic fantasy, fantasy romance, and romantasy? And I saw that you've talked kind of quite thoughtfully about where your work fits in that spread.
I'll caveat this by saying that a lot of people have a lot of different strong opinions on the answer to this question. So my answer might not be the same as another romantasy author's answer. But for me, romantic fantasy is a fantasy story with a strong romantic subplot. So I'll cite a very popular series in this genre, like the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas is a seven book epic fantasy series in which there are very strong romantic subplots in it. But you're following one set of characters over the course of 7 books, and there's a lot of other big fantasy stuff going on. Fantasy romance is like, it is a romance, capital R romance story, happily ever after ending, self-contained, that happens to take place in a fantasy setting. I personally consider romantasy to be kind of the umbrella term that encapsulates both of those things. I always feel like authors are kind of more concerned with this terminology than readers are, which is sometimes necessary because we're talking to editors and people kind of in the biz who are aware of the distinctions between those terms. I think that in general, the readership of both of those things tends to be kind of similar, like people who like magic and kissing. Is there magic and kissing? Yes, there are in both of those things. So I see romantasy as kind of the umbrella term that encapsulates both of those.
That's a very helpful answer, and I'm sure you're absolutely right in that readers probably don't care all that much about the difference between the three. You mentioned that this is a planned 6-book series and that there's lots of different types of vampires, lots of gods. It sounds like basically quite a lot for you to be keeping in your head at one time. How do you keep track of what you want to achieve with each installment?
At times poorly. Okay, so I actually have only recently started keeping track of like a organized story Bible. I started using a program called Obsidian that I think a lot of Dungeons and Dragons that's kind of like where I came up with it, from the Dungeons and Dragons community, because we're all nerds, so we all share the same tools. To kind of keep track of all the gods and who everybody is described as and who has what color eyes. So if they turn up again 6 books from now, I remember. I definitely make mistakes and definitely forget things. But on a bigger picture level, I always knew how I wanted to structure the series. So it's 6 books. And the whole overarching like fantasy plot takes place over the course of all 6 books. So it is like one 6-book series. But within those 6 books, there are 3 duologies. So the spotlight kind of shifts from POV character to POV character. The first duology taking place in one of the vampire kingdoms, the second duology in another, and then the third in the last one, kind of the grand finale. So it was kind of intended to be the best of both worlds for me. My last series was a trilogy. And by the end of that, I was very much like, wow, I don't think I have the attention span to do like a 7-book series following the exact same characters. So it's like kind of the best of both worlds for me.
And we found this other nice line that you had where you said, all my books are adult fantasy and include some degree of spice, although some are steamier than others. So how sexually explicit is the stuff you're writing? And again, within the broader romantasy genre, how do people tend to tread that line?
This is always a funny question for me to answer sometimes, because like the spice scale varies so much depending on who you're talking to. So The Serpent and the Wings of Night, when I wrote it, I was like, this is definitely the steamiest book I have ever written. Like there is explicit on-page sex in all of my books. There was like a 7,000 word sex scene. I mean, it felt like a lot to me. And then I put it out there, and then people on TikTok were like, oh, I really like this book. It's a shame that it wasn't very spicy though. And I was like, whew, okay. Wow, we just keep upping the ante on this. So for me, I always describe them as like 3 chili peppers out of 5 chili peppers. But there are going to be some people on TikTok in particular who are going to be like, yeah, it's barely spicy. And then there are going to be lots of people who are often readers kind of outside of the romantasy space, or who are not really coming from the book talk world, who are going to be like, wow, this is like basically porn. So it's interesting how much the lens shifts there. To answer the second part of your question about like the genre expectation here, it's interesting because this has been a discussion I've seen happening as to whether like it's a genre requirement for there to be on-page spice or on-page sex in a romantasy book. I don't think so. I think that a romantasy story
is spice the like accepted industry term of art?
It is, yes. I would say so. I mean, at least the way that people talk about it, like on social media. So sorry that my social media terminology is coming out in this discussion.
No, I love it. I love the idea of like a sort of restaurant menu having the sort of flame or chili emojis next to the book. How do you find the experience of actually writing sex scenes? Do you find them easy or difficult to write?
They're difficult. They're difficult. I'm going to try to answer this question with zero double entendres, which I have the sense of humor of a 12-year-old boy. So sorry in advance if I fail at that. They're challenging. And I actually, jokes aside, and people always laugh when I say this, I liken them to action scenes because it's like writing a good sex scene and writing a good fight scene. I think it's the same toolbox. Like both of those things are things that are, when you're living it, are very high octane. But when you're writing about it, can be really boring to say, and then I hit this guy a bunch of times, and then I kissed this guy a bunch of times, like both of those things require you to kind of tell it in a way that's compelling to a reader when there's not necessarily a lot of like dialogue or like plot movement happening. So they're challenging. You have to like choreograph them. And I try to have a sense of forward plot movement in a sense, maybe in a kind of non-traditional sense, but I try to come out of every sex scene that I write, something in the story, something in the character's relationship is like markedly, noticeably different at the end of the scene than at the beginning.
So we also love on the show to get into the kind of mechanics of how people's book deals and publishing arrangements worked. And we were really interested to see that you're kind of straddling at the moment, moving from independent publishing to traditional publishing, while at the same time retaining your rights for ebook and audio. So could you tell us about how that move has come about and how it's all, working out?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So I am still, I would say at least like I'll call myself half independently published. So I started self-publishing around 2016 or 2017. I self-published 3 books that are no longer available because they are not very good. And then in 2020, I self-published Daughter of No Worlds, which was very slow to kind of build an audience, but ultimately that series is how I was able to become a full-time author. So I am a major proponent of independent publishing. I think that it's a lot, people listening can't hear me, but I'll say easier in scare quotes because I know nothing in publishing is easy. But I think I'll say it's a lot more attainable, I think, to make a living in a mid-list situation, as in, kind of the general public doesn't know your name. You're not going to be hitting any bestseller lists. But I think it's become a lot more attainable to make a good living that way independently than trying to go through a publisher. And the other thing that I appreciate about independent publishing that has allowed my career to flourish as it has, so far, is that you don't really have this sense that like you have to perform up to a certain standard by a publisher's benchmark for you, when they purchased your book. You're allowed to kind of build a career slowly and not really have that hurt your chances at a subsequent deal. So, anyway, yes, I was self-published for a while, and then The Serpent and the Wings of Night really took off on Book Talk and whatnot. And then about a year and change, I was approached by Bramble, who is now my publisher for print. I was very adamant that I wanted to hold on to those ebook rights. And Bramble has been a wonderful partner in getting these books to a wider print audience.
And why ebooks in particular? Is it because that's where a lot of your readers, read your work? Is that because you've built up a bit of a following that way and you want to kind of stay true to that part of your kind of authorial identity? Why audiobook and ebook specifically?
So to get into like kind of more of the business nitty-gritty, on the print side, as an indie author, you're very limited in how you can get your books out there. So there's essentially kind of like mostly one big name distributor for independent authors in print, Ingram Spark. And Ingram Spark has been very good to me, but just by the nature of print on demand. So print on demand, for those who don't know, is like if you go to my indie titles on Amazon and you order one copy, then over there in some warehouse Ingram Spark is going to print one copy and send it to you. So that way, indie authors who are not selling thousands and thousands of books don't have to go to China and order 10,000 books or whatever, and foot that cost and store it and et cetera, the way that publishers do. But the downside of that is that the profit margins kind of suck. It's expensive. It makes it very, very difficult for brick and mortar stores to get enough of a discount that they can afford to sell your book. And then also, there's not really like a sales team who's out there actually introducing your books to these brick and mortar stores. So basically, the whole infrastructure for like getting print books to print distribution networks at scale simply does not really exist as an indie author, at least not very well. So that was my main impetus for wanting to get a print deal specifically, because those are so many channels that I just cannot access. I wanted to hang on to ebook because I was doing just fine with ebook, and it was hard to kind of justify giving up a massive amount of that income when I had all the tools I needed to be able to distribute the books in that way. And then audio, I actually do have an audio publisher, Podium. So those rights had already been sold to Podium, and I couldn't sell them even if I had wanted to, which I'm very happy with Podium. If you're listening, you guys are great. So no issues there.
We wanted to come back to some of this kind of ins and outs of the publishing biz stuff, but could we roll back now to your early life? Where did your initial interest in books and writing come from, and was romance something you were reading early? And also, how early is too early to read romance?
I say it's never too early. I mean, it probably is a little too early. I did have a former teacher once.
What, even at three chilies and above?
Ooh, yeah, no, probably not. I'm not going to go on the record saying that. I'd say if you guys were anything like me, I was definitely sneaking my fair share of inappropriate reading material when I was, in middle school. But yeah, I did once have my middle school English teacher reached out to me because I published under my actual name and was like, oh, a student was reading this book and I had a student by this name. And I was like, maybe a sixth grader shouldn't be reading that book. Yeah, so I was reading a lot when I was very young. I was writing a lot, and I was writing very dark stuff, like more so than the romance being the concerning part to authority figures in my life. It was definitely like I wrote a lot of death, like a lot of very dark things. I had a very happy, very boring childhood in middle-class America. So I don't know where all this was coming from. And then I used to write things chapter by chapter and put them on the internet when I was like 12, 13 years old. That was how I wrote my first novel, which actually ended up being a very proto version of Daughter of No Worlds, which I revisited and took certain like fundamental ideas from like some 10 years later. So it all worked out. But yeah, it was very fun. I was always very creative. I just liked to make things up and share them with people.
In terms of the things that you were reading, was it a lot of like fantasy? I mean, you mentioned the fact you were interested more in the darker side of things than the romance. I mean, was it things like Tolkien? Was it lots of kind of world building, kind of magical places? What was the sort of stuff that you were consuming?
Definitely a lot of fantasy. I read Howl's Moving Castle when I was in early middle school, and it like changed my life. I loved it so much. I also saw the Studio Ghibli movie that came out around that time, and that also changed my life in like a different way, but they were both very fundamental influences for me. So yeah, a lot of fantasy. I was also a very contrarian kid. It was like, this was kind of the heyday of Twilight. So I always confess with some bashfulness now that even as a vampire romance writer, I have never read Twilight, which I need to because it's fundamental canon, in my genre. But at the time, I was like too cool for that. It was too popular for me. I was too contrarian. But yeah, lots of dark fantasy type stuff at the time.
And we saw that before you became a full-time writer, you worked in marketing at a variety of different firms. And you've mentioned that there were skills that you'd kind of learnt from that you were then able to apply to, getting your own work out there and read. Could you tell us about some of that?
Sure. Yeah. So I went to school for graphic design, and then I went into marketing in the cybersecurity industry. And so both of those two things prepared me a lot for my indie publishing career, kind of like on a tactical level, because like I just had the familiarity with things like Photoshop, and I knew how to run pay-per-click ads and that kind of stuff, just like tactical. On a bigger picture level, I think the biggest thing I learned from my time in marketing is that most marketing does not work. And that was very helpful for me in my indie career, because I think one of the biggest pitfalls of new indie authors is that your attention is pulled in 10 million different directions, because there's 10 million different people telling you that you have to do this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing. And it's all people giving genuine advice. Maybe these are all people who had genuine success doing X, Y, or Z thing. But coming out of a career in marketing, I had seen firsthand that a lot of things don't have impact. And that allowed me to be very ruthlessly efficient about where I spent my time.
What are some of the things that don't have impact, out of interest?
Ooh, you're going to get me in trouble. I think that a lot of fluffy things don't matter as much as people think that they do. So at least at the scale that I was working at the time. So things like just having like really flashy graphics for things. Like I would see a lot of authors spend a lot of time on like very flashy PR packages for their books, which again, don't get me wrong, those things do have impact at a certain level, but it's not, for me, it wasn't the most high impact place to be spending my time at the level that I was at. Things like, just making sure that you post something on social media, like not really caring what it was, but just like posting something every single day. Like a lot of those kind of arbitrary rules that a lot of people were sinking a lot of energy into, especially when you're an indie author who's starting out, you still have a day job, or you have a family, or you have both a day job and a family, and you're trying to prioritize your time. It was very helpful to be able to see the scale where that impact could fall.
If it's all right, we'd like to ask you a bunch of really geeky inside baseball questions about self-publishing and stuff like that, because I think our listeners would be completely fascinated in this. So could you tell us, from those like early steps where you're putting stuff online, like where are you putting the work out? Did you have any external editorial support in terms of other people working on the manuscripts? Like how did you design the covers? How did you go about, really from the ground level, building this all up?
I love talking about this. So yes, I tried to produce as professional a book as possible. And there was definitely a learning curve to just learning how to do that and kind of building up what I'll call my like trusted stable of professionals. So in the very, very beginning, I did copy editing, and I had editors and proofreaders that I worked with. But of course, it takes some time to like find the people who you jive with. I'll describe to you what my self-publishing process is now, which has taken me a few years to kind of refine. So I outline a book. I will send it to my friend / beta reader / indie editor, and usually kind of bounce some ideas around with him. And then I draft the book. And then I'll do a passive edits myself, and I will give it to usually about like 5 to 8 beta readers, like chapter by chapter as I'm editing it. And these beta readers are like, they're not editors, they are readers. And I always find it helpful to get like reader feedback, because if you show something to an editor, they're going to look at it through editor eyes. Or if you show it to another author, they're going to look at it through those eyes. It's always kind of nice to see how readers who are just reading to read react to things. So they'll give me feedback. I am usually giving it to the same aforementioned friend / beta reader / editor at the same time. And he's like editing it. And then I will consolidate all of their feedback at once together in one pass. And then that version will be the one that I send to my first proofreader. And then they'll send me that back. I'll integrate all their edits. I'll do another read through myself. And then I will send it to proofreader number 2. And then I do my formatting myself. So I use this very wonderful program called Vellum that does a lot of the hard work for me. And this is also usually the stage where I will send to ARC readers. So just advanced review copies if I'm doing that. And then usually for an indie book, the pain and the pleasure of indie publishing is that once you finish a book, you just hit a button and it's out there. So I, as an indie author, tend to run pretty close to deadline. for pre-orders and things like that. So at this point, usually we are pretty close to release day. And then I'm like into full-on promo push at that point.
And then in terms of taking on all that feedback, how do you sort of prioritize or differentiate between all the different comments that you're getting? I mean, are you pretty selective, or do you try and trust as much of the reader's judgment as possible?
So at this point, I have a lot of, I've really built up a rapport with like this group of people that I work with. In the beginning, it was challenging because sometimes I was getting feedback that was just different from my own vision for the book. Not wrong, but just different. And it's harder to try to parse what you want to take and what you don't want to. Part of the reason why I try to have at least 5 beta readers is because then you see trends. Like every once in a while, I'll have one person who says, I'm really confused by this thing, but it's just like the one person. But then if I start to see those trends, where I start to see, okay, 5 people said this thing, like 5 people had issues with this scene or this line, that's how I know that I need to adjust it. I also have my editor friend he's very much like a fantasy guy, whereas like my readers, some of them are fantasy readers, some of them are romantasy readers, some of them are romance readers. So it is kind of funny sometimes where he'll pick up on something that's like kind of a trope, like kind of a romance trope, and he'll be like, this isn't believable to me. And I'll be like, well, yeah, it's probably not.
And we saw in another interview, you mentioned that when you were starting out, you made a conscious decision that you weren't going to submit to agents and traditional publishers at that stage. What was your decision-making process then?
So a few things. I have always been very entrepreneurial. I was always very interested in running small businesses. I worked in like kind of startup world. So I was just genuinely interested in self-publishing. I thought it was like a really cool way to be artistic and running a business at the same time. Kind of as I mentioned earlier, I also felt like it was a more attainable route to maybe making a living, while also I had absolutely no illusions that I never thought that I was going to be nearly as mainstream known as I am now. I mean, I truly never ever thought that was going to happen. So there was that aspect of it. And then I will admit, I was also scared. I was very intimidated by that process. Oh, and one other thing, important thing, I was kind of writing romantasy before it was really called romantasy. And traditional publishing didn't really have a place for that. At least that was the impression that I got from outside, because a lot of what we now call romantasy was kind of being aged down and put onto YA shelves. And I was not really interested in writing YA. And I kind of felt like I didn't know that there was a path forward for this subgenre in traditional publishing at that time. I could have been wrong about that, but that was just the feeling that I got.
And so how did you, well, firstly, were you confident that you would find a ready audience for your work, a ready adult audience to your work? And then how did you go about sort of building it and finding it, and particularly the role of TikTok within that?
No, I was not confident that I would find an audience. I kind of thought, I'll tell my stories and put them out there and kind of see what happens. This is going to blow your minds because it sounds crazy now coming at it from the angle that I'm at. At the time, the name of the game in self-publishing was rapid release, which meant that the main rhetoric was that you had to be releasing 6 to 10 books a year in order to make a living in self-publishing. I know. Yeah, it was. Yes. And I had a full-time job. So that was kind of what I was trying to do, like at first. And that's part of why my first few books were like really not so great. I also had to learn how to tell a good story, So that was kind of one way that some indie authors were building an audience. And I did genuinely question whether it was going to be possible for me to find an audience releasing 2 books a year instead of 6 to 10 books a year. And I realized, not to sound like cliche, but I realized once I started being kind of more, I don't want to say more invested or more passionate, because I don't want to say that I wasn't before. But Daughter of No Worlds was very much a book that I wrote because I wanted to. I really, really loved writing it. And I kind of had a very clear understanding of why I thought someone would like it on a very specific level. And I realized that when you're very specific about who is going to love your book and why they are going to love it, and if you're able to encapsulate that in a very snappy way, and you just tell those people, you tell them why they're going to like it, sometimes you get lucky and they actually start finding that. It took a while. But I do think that that is part of why that book was the first one of mine to actually start building an audience.
You've mentioned the advent of the term romantasy, and it's clearly a lot of discussion about it at the moment. How have you found perceptions of the kind of work that you and your peers are doing from the publishing industry, but also from the wider culture? How has that changed in the past few years?
This is a tough question for me to answer because I had someone else asking me a question similar to that before, like, oh, how does it feel to be taken seriously? And it's like, I never, particularly because I was self-published, it was never something that I thought was going to happen. Like, I just never thought that anyone was going to take me seriously. I just accepted that. I mean, up until less than a year ago, when The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King, when it was first released independently, hit the Wall Street Journal bestseller list and stuff, I went into a bookstore and I was kind of doing that very awkward, like, oh, I'm an author, maybe we could do, I'm a local author, we could do something or sign something or whatever. And they were very like, sure you are, honey, So I think I like that there's a term for it. I like that there's kind of a way to put a label on this subgenre where there's a very hungry audience for it. And I love to see that it's kind of out there in the public consciousness. I also see a lot of people kind of being dismissive of it. And I think that that's okay. I mean, it's as long as a book is out there and people are reading it and enjoying it, to me, that is a good book. That's all that I aspire to as a storyteller.
That feels very noble. I mean, if it were me in that bookstore experience, I'd be like, hang on a second, I've sold loads of copies. Why are you kind of not turning your nose up, but why are you being funny about it? Was there not a sense of kind of righteous anger when you had that experience?
I do. I mean, I don't know. I figure I can invest in, I get, not to brag, I mean, it sounds crazy coming out of my mouth too. I get literally hundreds of comments and emails and DMs a day from people saying, oh my God, I read this book and it really touched me in this way, or it really meant a lot to me. So I can focus on all that stuff, or I can focus on like the random guy on Twitter who says that like romance is not real literature, One of those is going to make me a lot happier than the other.
And then when the crossover point came and when, big publishing came knocking and Bramble and stuff like that, tell us about how that worked, just as a process, and then also what it felt like emotionally.
It was overwhelming. It was also a very crazy time in my life because I was very pregnant at the time. So I have a 1-year-old baby. And this was when I was dealing with some of the worst deadlines of my life. And then also dealing with almost having a baby and then all of these calls happening at the same time. So you definitely get a lot of FOMO. I think that almost all indie authors have a bit of a chip on our shoulder because we all kind of feel a little bit like outsiders to the publishing world. So when you have like the big traditional publishers kind of coming at your doorstep, it feels very surreal. And then you get this kind of innate feeling of like, oh my gosh, they like me. They really like me. You get that feeling. We actually turned down quite a few offers because once you get past that initial hump of like, wow, I got this call with these wonderful, talented people and they love my book and they're going to give me all this money and blah, 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 blah. And you actually sit down and take the emotions out of it and do the math. A lot of times, if you're doing very well in self-publishing, the math does not math very well. And I'm very lucky that I have excellent agents who are very open to self-publishing and they really understand the value of self-publishing. So they weren't just going to say, the first time the Big Five publisher came to me, they weren't going to just tell me to take that deal without like seriously crunching some numbers. So we were very discerning about what kind of a deal we were looking for.
At what point did you get agents on board if you had been, managing a lot of the process yourself? Was it when big publishers came knocking, you thought actually it'd be helpful to have an intermediary here?
Yes, this is a great question. And it was actually really difficult because it's hard to find agents who are willing to represent authors that are not bringing them a new book to kind of just traditionally publish. So I got agents involved when I was starting to get a lot of foreign offers. I had a UK publisher that was interested, and that was the first time that I was like, you know what? I can't negotiate this myself. I really need help here. And I just emailed, I was just looking for agents that I knew represented other indie authors. And I was just basically sending this kind of SOS, frantic query to them with all my sales figures and all the information about the books and help, I have this offer on the table right now and I don't know what to do kind of thing. And I was very lucky that my agent, who does a lot of work with the Alliance of Independent Authors, so they were very familiar with this world, thankfully answered me out of their very busy query inbox.
Is it expected in the field you're operating in that you will write series? Is that a kind of non-negotiable? And kind of similar to that question, is a happy ending non-negotiable in this kind of romance? Great
question. I would say in some way, yeah. There are some series that are like romance series in the the capital R romance genre. They're kind of usually connected by a setting of some kind, or maybe it's a band and they all have the different members of the band, but each book is a standalone. So in the romantasy world, there are a few authors who are doing things like that, writing very traditional capital R romance series in a fantasy setting. So I think of, for example, Elise Kova. She has a series called Married to Magic, and they're all standalones, but they are kind of in a shared universe. I think especially in indie publishing, it's definitely more lucrative to have a series because you're capturing that audience. All you have to do is build up an audience for one book, and then you have kind of a captive audience for other books as well. I don't really see many people in indie publishing doing true standalones. I see that more in traditional publishing. The happy ending thing is a tricky question. I mean, there are some people who have very strong feelings as to whether a happily ever after ending is a requirement of romantasy. I think generally, yes. I mean, if I wrote a romantasy series and marketed it as romantasy, and it was this 5-book series about this couple getting together, and then I had them break up at the end, that would maybe not make people very happy.
And you mentioned earlier in the interview that you had sort of, after early writing efforts, really focused on sort of your craft and the art of telling a good story. And this is something that you've talked about on TikTok as well. I very much enjoyed watching your videos earlier. You've talked about using a 7-point story structure to get yourself started, and also the importance of finding the midpoint. Can you tell us a little bit about how you actually put a story together?
I am in the middle of doing that right now, so it's very timely. Every time I sit down to do it, I'm like, oh my God, how do I do it? I don't know. I've never done it before. Maybe I'll never do it again. How do we know? Yeah, I love finding beat sheets. I am kind of a plantser, so I call myself kind of halfway through a pantser and a plotter. Particularly coming from the indie publishing world, where efficiency is very highly sought after. I kind of learned how to be efficient, which means that I try to come up with my plot beforehand, so that way I'm not rewriting a ton after the fact, which unfortunately I did do in a recent book, and it was very painful, and I'm determined to never do it again. So I come up with the theme first. I usually put my two romantic leads, on kind of opposite sides of this theme so they can explore it through each other and through their relationship. I come up with the ending. And like you mentioned, I come up with that midpoint, which is where the character will have some kind of a major defining moment that shifts their relationship to that theme. Everything is very emotionally driven for me. I tend to get easily overwhelmed when I start thinking about all the bits and bobs of the crazy fantasy world that I'm in. So I try to always come back to that emotional core, and that's what I let drive me as I'm coming up with the story.
There's a huge readership for romance of all kinds, not just romantasy, but much wider. And this is maybe a slightly broader and kind of philosophical question, but given that romance, maybe traditionally, although I appreciate not exclusively, does often suggest quite traditional gender roles or stereotypes and things like that, what do you think the fact that it is so hugely popular says about a culture, that maybe ostensibly would be opposed to some of these things or things like that. Is there any tension there, or do you think it's just, that people are just really into this stuff?
Sorry, I just want to make sure I understand your question. Opposed to?
I suppose. Sorry, yeah, I didn't phrase it that well. To say that there's that romance traditionally, you have these kind of traditional tropes of sort of rugged men with chiseled jawlines and all this kind of thing.
Yes.
And happy ever after endings and a marriage plot and things like that. And there's a lot of kind of criticism in the wider culture about some of these ideas of maybe how women's lives are traditionally portrayed and stuff like that. Why is there such an appetite for these books when, in a sense, the culture sort of has been pushing other lines? Does that make sense? If that,
I do. I think so. We're kind of talking about the divide between like what people find appealing in books versus what they find appealing in real life.
Yeah, or what they say they find appealing in real life.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha. I gotcha. Well, yeah. I think everyone loves a love story, and I think for me, what's kind of fun about romantasy and doing these romance stories in a fantasy setting, in a fantasy world? Well, first of all, I just like fantasy stories in these very big, epic stakes fantasies. So on the fantasy to romance spectrum, I consider myself a bit further on the fantasy side than on the romance side. But the other thing that's really cool about fantasy for me is that you get to extract the real world. You get to take the real world away from your romance setting. So like, if anyone was in an actual situation like the ones that I write about in my romances, I would be like, honey, you've got to go. Like, you should not be in this situation. This is not the guy for you. Even a little murder is too much murder in real life. But what's fun about books is that
it's a red flag.
It's a red flag.
Someone, generally, isn't it?
It's a red flag. And what's kind of funny about that is that I don't even write like the dark stuff, like dark romance is like, I mean, there's dark. I write what I will call dark fantasy romance, but the dark goes with the fantasy, not with the romance. Because despite all the dark things that are happening in the world, the characters are always quite respectful of each other once they're in an actual relationship, Dark romance can get dark. I think that people understand the difference between fiction and real life, and that it's kind of fun, even with those like really kind of taboo things, to be able to just have those imaginary worlds without feeling like it needs to be a reflection. I mean, I think, not to get too philosophical about it, but I think women and a lot of other, anyone who's dealing with any level of like oppression in real life, where you have to, fight to be taken seriously, or you're doing so much of that in real life. It's kind of nice to read a story in which somebody can just like have this really like intense, devoted, huge, muscular guy who's going to like make sure that nobody gives you shit ever again. And then also have your own giant magical sword that can also make sure that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, you might be a bit envious of the magical sword when it comes to real life again. In terms of character, how do you go about constructing them? I've seen that you partly use sketches to help you kind of visualize them, and also sometimes make a list of characters that you like on TV or on film, and then draw particular aspects of them and then combine them into something new. Can you tell us a little bit about how you populate your fantasy worlds?
Sure. So, like I said, theme is definitely the most important thing that comes to me when I'm writing a book. So I'll usually start out and I'll have like this super vague idea of like a character type that I want to do. So when I was starting The Serpent and the Wings of Night, I knew I wanted to write kind of like a cranky, like sort of badass female character, because I hadn't written someone like that. And I knew I wanted him to kind of be the more extroverted type character, but super, super vague. So then I come up with the theme of the book, and I construct a lot of their personalities around that. And I will usually try to kind of take contrasting elements of it for each of them. And then usually through their dynamic with each other, their personalities will take shape. Character writing is my favorite part. I think that's why I end up writing romance in general, because it's just like character writing on steroids, like fantasy setting or not. It's so much fun.
And do you have, in terms of your sense of your audience, was the fact that you were self-published initially, has that given you a kind of clearer breakdown in terms of who your demographic is and stuff like that? I mean, do you get a sense of who your key audience is?
I feel like I do. I don't know that I have any more access to like demographic data than publishers do. I mean, I might have more access to it because I guess I can access it, whereas like someone who has to go through a publisher might not be able to. But I don't get like demographic information other than what, my Instagram followers count statistics will show me. I feel like I know, in the sense that like I know what other stuff my readers generally like. And I generally have a good sense of like why they enjoy my work. And then more recently, I've had the opportunity to go to conventions and things like that and actually like meet people, which is really lovely to put a face to that. So I think so in a vague sense. But there's probably surprises out there.
I'm sure there are. There's this devoted superfan that doesn't fit any of the stereotypes somewhere out there.
Yeah.
It's rule of the show that we always ask about money. So be as open or as closed as you like, but tell us a little bit about how your career has taken shape financially, as I know you now are a full-time author. So was that about a year ago that you were able to pursue it as a full-time career?
I became a full-time author. It was more than a year ago. I hadn't published The Serpent and the Wings of Night yet. So I became a full-time author just off of my previous series. So when I make that point about indie publishing being a more attainable, quote unquote, route for mid-list financial security, that's kind of what I'm saying, because I think from a reader perspective or from an outside perspective, someone might not have thought that I would be a full-time author at that level of notoriety that I was at the time. And I was making, I came out of an industry in tech. I worked for Microsoft. So I was making, 6 figures doing that at that time off of those 3 books. I was able to make that jump partly out of desperation because I had a very demanding job. And I just was going to have a mental breakdown. So I worked in marketing in tech, as we mentioned earlier. And I was also able to that's an industry where you can kind of do, you can kind of consult if you had to. So that was kind of also my way of telling myself, well, if I make this jump, I can continue kind of consulting on the side for a few hours a week and keep my toes in it. And then if everything collapses on me, I'll be able to get back into that industry, hopefully without much issue. And it just ended up working out. But that was why I was very stressed when I was conceptualizing the Crowns of Nyaxia series, because I was like, well, this is my job now. So I sure hope that people like what I do next and it doesn't all just fall flat on its face.
And do you have a sense, both of yourself and other writers in the area that you're writing, of how the readership skews male-female?
Overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly. I actually laugh a little bit because when I do solo author events, it's just it's like a sea of women and a few, boyfriends, husbands. And then my grandfather, who occasionally comes to these things, he always goes around to all of the men in the room and is like, I don't understand why men don't read her books. I mean, they're there's wars, there's fantasy. Why do you think that men don't read these books? So just imagine an 80-year-old, very friendly man just going around asking why don't more men read your books?
And what do they answer?
I mean, I think that they're very polite to him because he's a very nice 80-year-old man, but I'm pretty sure that it's because there's too much romance. I mean, I have had a few men come up to me and say, that they were surprised by how much they liked it, which, thanks. I'll accept that as a compliment. I think the romance aspect, not to get on my feminist rant here, but there's kind of this perception that guy stuff is gender neutral, but girl stuff is for girls only,
Yeah, there's some quite depressing statistics actually about kind of I think it's male readers only read male authors and female readers obviously read both. We're coming towards the end of our time. So final question from me. You've said that you'd really like to write a game. And I wondered what it was about that format that appealed to you more than, say, a screenplay or a play or anything else.
There's honestly so many different formats of things I would love to do. I mean, I'd love to do a game because I was a gamer. Actually, when I mentioned being in middle school and writing stories chapter by chapter on the internet, it was actually a video game design website that I used to do that on. And they had like a blog section that I would post my stuff on. So that just would be fun to me because of my personal interests. I would also love to do like a graphic novel or an animated series specifically. Doing film always is very intimidating to me because it just seems like there's just so many hands in it. It just seems so frustrating to like, I don't know. I have huge admiration for anybody who can like deal with the film industry. It seems so wildly intimidating to me. But yeah, I would love to do a game.
And a final question from me. I think Rachel and I are both still reeling from what you were saying, a few years ago was the expected output that people were meant to produce. But, how much, both now and going forward, what is your output that you're expected to produce, or what is what is your production per year, or?
It's, yeah. I'm still trying to figure out my answer to that question as well. It's also interesting because I've kind of been out of that world for enough that even when I said it out loud to you guys just now, I was like, wow, that seems crazy. But I actually just came from a romance conference. Even in traditional publishing, there were many romance authors who were putting out, double digits books a year through Harlequin and whatever. I was just on a panel with one of them. I was shocked by it.
Is that like a studio system though? Are they kind of putting their name to it, but there's a sort of writer's room producing them, or are they literally writing 10 books a year?
Oh no, they were writing them. I mean, they were on the shorter side. I was just speaking with her. Elle James was the author I was sitting with at this conference. She had written 150 books. She says that she puts out between 10 and 12 books a year. Now they're on the shorter side. They're kind of more 50,000 words. So that, to anyone who's not familiar with that benchmark, is about like between a novella and a novel.
But that's still not nothing though.
No, it's not.
Like that's 500,000 words a year, right? That she's writing.
Yeah. It's they do, and that's
like the Old Testament. I mean, it's like, I know, it's like a lot of words.
I know. I was really, and on this panel, I've published about 11 books in the last 6 years. I'm probably wrong about that, but thereabouts. But on this panel, when everybody was going down saying how many books that they've done, I was by far the slowest one, like hands down. Everyone else was like, oh yeah, I have like 45 books out. It's crazy. I mean, no one is more prolific than romance authors. They know how to put words on a page.
I have never felt less productive in my entire life.
Seriously. And some of these, my excuse is like, oh, I have a baby, my life is, but some of these women had small children, like.
Yeah, it's no excuse, Carissa. You've got to get back to the grindstone.
I know. I got to pick it up. I was trying to say, but mine are, they're fantasy. There's like big things. There's God Wars, 150,000 words. But yeah, no excuse. So yeah, to answer your question, I'm trying to do like 2 books a year. It's challenging. I'm still trying to figure out what my new baseline is. I didn't really end up taking much of a maternity leave because all the production stuff of The Serpent and the Wings of Night was happening like right when I had my son. So I actually have a picture of holding him, and I was doing copy edits on The Serpent and the Wings of Night for like the Bramble version. When he was 9 days old, he was like a little potato, just like sitting on my lap. But yeah, I would like to do 2 a year. We'll see. Even though this is my job, and so I arrange childcare and whatnot, like as if it is a job. But I still work much, much less than I did before, where I was working about 12 hours a day most of the time. So we'll see.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for coming on the show, and wishing you all the best with the Crown of Nyaxis series and all your other pursuits going forward.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Carissa Broadbent. She's on Twitter at Carissa Nasra, that's Nasyra. She's on Instagram at Carissa Broadbent Books, and she's on TikTok at Carissa Broadbent. The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King is published by Tor. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Carissa?
I really enjoyed speaking with Carissa. We've had one romance novelist on Always Take Notes several years ago, but it's not another, and it was definitely time to get one. And I think it's fascinating because it's a huge industry, right? Like, these books sell in enormous quantities. It's a massive market, and I think it was really interesting to hear how it all worked, and particularly how she'd made this move from self-publishing to being, from an imprint from a big house. Some of the stuff that I thought was very interesting, she talked about this kind of culture of the kind of cult of productivity within romance noveldom, like this extraordinary amount of novel that they're producing each year, which I thought was very interesting. I thought she gave some thoughtful answers to the question of what these books say about what people really want and don't want in romantic relationships as opposed to in books. And I thought she was just very interesting to have. What about you?
Yeah, you covered all of it there. My mind was slightly blown by the rapid release strategy of, I think it was between 6 and 10 books a year. And my mind cannot...
I think it might have been more. I think that some of the elite practitioners may have been producing more than that. And it just completely bamboozles me, right?
My brain cannot comprehend that level of output. But it was interesting as well how the need for efficiency, in her words, affects her approach to plotting versus punching. And I thought it was fascinating as well, to your point about how big this industry is now, how the attitudes of traditional publishers have been forced to change as well. There was once this snobbery, and now every publisher in town wants to sign the next big romantasy novel in series, because it's where the TikTok readers are at. So yes, I'm really glad we got her on the show. I thought she was really thoughtful guest, and I'm sure it won't be the last either. What have you been up to, Simon?
I am beavering away on... So I finished writing the first super, super rough version of my nonfiction book. And I am now into the edits with the objective of getting 3 pretty clean chapters to my agent before I go away at the end of this week, hopefully to have a kind of trailer that he can take to the Frankfurt Book Fair in October to try and sell translations. So it's good. I mean, it's a different job, and this is a kind of Frankenstein job for these chapters because they partially existed in the proposal when we sold the book, but in different forms, and in 2 different forms, one for Britain and one for the US. And I'm mixed in with sort of different new material. So it is like stitching a sort of Frankenbeast together. But I think I will have something to give him before I go away. So that has been good. Rachel, what about you?
Well, good luck with the final stitches of the Frankenbeast. I've been just kind of trucking along with previously advertised pieces which I've had published, and yes, trying to also similarly tie up some loose ends before I go away. I've been watching The Perfect Couple on Netflix, which is incredibly addictive but also complete trash. So if anyone is looking for easy Sunday night watching, as I was, it was quite fun, but it does not stick the landing.
Oh, I failed to say what I've been consuming. I've been watching Clio, which is this kind of quite dark comedy about a former Stasi killer agent on the rampage in Berlin in the 90s. So that is quite fun. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. We're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.